The NHL head coach carousel was very busy, turned a lot this offseason, but which of the new hires has the toughest job ahead? All that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Friday, everyone, and thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. I am Rachel Donner from Locked On Flyers. I'm here each and every Friday with Gil Martin of Locked On Islanders. You can find the show over on YouTube or anywhere you listen to podcasts to get our latest episode as soon as it's available here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. Before we dive into the coaching carousel and expectations for next season, just want to acknowledge the Hockey Canada trial has concluded. All 5 players were found not guilty in a Canadian court. None of them are currently under contract with any NHL team and will not be so for the time being. If that changes, we will talk about it on the show moving forward. Now, we have 9 new head coaches in the NHL at the moment, and that's a lot, right?
It's almost a third of the league, really. It's a pretty high number, yeah.
Yeah, so with all this kind of upheaval behind the bench, there's going to be a lot of players and a lot of teams making some big adjustments. And I think when you look at that overall, the biggest adjustment that these guys are going to have to make is just system. So there's going to be a lot of players playing on teams with completely new systems.
And that is always an adjustment. It's like, even if you're in an office job and you get a new supervisor, they want things done a little bit differently. And what you're used to doing without even thinking about it may not be acceptable anymore or desirable anymore. So it is an adjustment. It does take time. And for some of these teams, especially those that have been winning in recent years, you hope the adjustment period isn't too long, because all of a sudden you get off to that slow start and things could snowball in the wrong direction.
Right. And I think there's, a lot of hope comes with these new coaching hires, yeah. Right? Because the previous coach is gone for a reason, right? Where they'd either kind of run out the clock on their time there, or just things were not working at all, right? Or the infamous "they lost the room" kind of aspect to it, which, I always find that to be a little esoteric for my taste. But, everybody has to describe these things in their own way and have a good reason for it. Now, when you look at these particular teams that have new head coaches, there is some variety in terms of level of success from these previous seasons, right? So you have the New York Rangers was the first new coaching hire of the offseason here with Mike Sullivan, who obviously kind of just got fired from the Pittsburgh Penguins, right? Who also now have a new coach, right, in Dan Muse, who was hired a little bit later on in the summer in early June. Joel Quenneville being hired by the Ducks, Adam Foote being hired by the Canucks, which was a case of an assistant coach getting a bump up there. And then Rick Tocchet, formerly of the Canucks, is now with the Philadelphia Flyers. Jeff Blashill has been behind the bench before, now is with the Chicago Blackhawks. Lane Lambert taking another turn and is coaching the Seattle Kraken. I mentioned Dan Muse and the Pens. We have Marco Sturm coaching the Boston Bruins, and then the final coaching hire of Glenn Gulutzan, hired by the Dallas Stars, who have had general levels of success. So there is kind of like, some rebuilding teams, some teams that just can't get over the hump, right, to get to the Stanley Cup. And there are some teams that are somewhere in the middle here. And I just find it interesting, like what prompts the firing and then what prompts this particular kind of hire for each of these teams.
Yeah, and look, it's always a little bit different in each particular case, but I mean, I think the constant is that somebody felt change was needed. And, I have seen instances where you would think the coach is safe. They do the exit interviews and all of a sudden management is like,
maybe not so much.
Maybe not so much, right? And all of a sudden the coach is out unexpectedly because the players said something to the GM that let the GM know that, hey, it's not as good as it looks from the outside, kind of a thing. And then, you also mention in some instances, you get assistant coaches who are promoted to head coach with the same team. That's a different dynamic altogether, because a lot of the time the assistant coach is sort of the good cop. He's the go-between where the players feel like, hey, we don't want to talk to the head coach directly, but we can always discuss this with the assistant coach, and maybe he talks to the head coach, or maybe we just have the assistant coach as an outlet for what we want to say but can't say. And then all of a sudden you go from being the good cop to the guy in charge, and it may not be an easy adjustment for an assistant becoming the head coach with the team he was just the assistant for.
Right. I think that's a really excellent point. And, the dynamics are going to be different in each of these cases. I think it's also interesting when you have former players come into the coaching realm, which some of these guys are. And to me, if you had to pick any one of these guys that maybe will have the easiest adjustment into the head coaching role and into the situation at hand, in some ways, to me, it's Marco Sturm in Boston, because I feel like he's a player's coach, gonna be naturally in a lot of ways, right? And I think Boston, the expectations are so low with considering where they are, that just getting ducks in a row this season and figuring out a system, figuring out what you've got in some of your prospects there. But, like the most they did was get Victor Arvidsson.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't do much else, right? And they don't have a lot going for them right now. So really, whatever happens, I think Marco Sturm's going to be okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only way he's not okay is if there's no improvement over the course of the season, or if the bottom just falls out, where, they're just historically unwatchable.
But that could have happened no matter what.
Correct.
That's the thing.
Correct.
to me.
Yeah, I mean, but I think in a situation like that, the only pressure is to show some progress, that the guys are believing in the new system, picking up on the new system, and being more comfortable in the new system. Again, like you said, the expectations that they'll actually even be NHL 500 this year, that would be an unbelievably successful season, I think, for the Boston Bruins this coming season. Now, look, they may surprise us, and who knows? That's why they play the games. But honestly, the pressure to win right now, minimal for Marco Sturm.
Right. I think so. And I think of it, like I said, of any of these teams, he probably has the least amount of pressure on him to find success this year. Is there anybody else, though, any of these other teams in the 9 that you think have kind of a low level expectation here?
I think out in Seattle, I think Lane Lambert has at least a year to sort of settle down and integrate his system. And that team is in a retool or a rebuild, depending on who you ask. And they want to get some of those young prospects to the next level and start to show progress. But, do most people pick them as a playoff team this year? Probably not. I think that Lane Lambert he doesn't have no pressure on him, but I think that there's less pressure on him than some of the other candidates out there.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's definitely a lot of questions. I questioned the hire to begin with,
Yeah.
but putting that aside, I think with Seattle, they started off on a very interesting foot. They're starting from jump with the expansion draft, making some selections that surprised a lot of people. It went very differently than the Vegas one did.
Yes.
And I think that kind of set the tone for how they chose to operate over the next couple of years. And they found themselves not being able to find their footing at all in their entire existence in some ways. Now, I think they did that first year to some degree because they just kind of rode on vibes the whole time.
Yeah.
But like, to be honest, but I do think that, the expectations there for this upcoming season are certainly low, but there are definitely some other teams that have a tougher road ahead. We are going to talk about some of those at the opposite end of the spectrum coming up next.
Today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You could track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. I know when I started using Monarch, I realized that I had more subscriptions than I even remembered that I had. And it certainly saved me some money by being able to find that out and to cancel them. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com. Code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year.
All right. So looking at some of the other new coaching hires and the road ahead and the adjustments for them, I think, when you get beyond Seattle and Boston that we were just discussing, I think there are some guys that are going to have a lot of pressure on them this upcoming year. And I would say that Mike Sullivan is number one on that list for me. The New York Rangers have been nothing but a disappointment for the last 2 years with a lot of promise and no delivery. And Mike Sullivan was tenured in Pittsburgh for a very long time. And so for him to have to make this adjustment and coach a new team now, I think on the upside, he had some experience with Team USA. And so jumping to a different group of players, albeit an elite, best of the best group of players, right. It's a different animal, right? But I think that just having to think in a different environment with a different set of players will be a good challenge for him. And I have no doubt that Mike Sullivan can do that and make that adjustment very easily. It's just, is this New York Rangers team going to be able to keep up with him? That's my question.
Yeah, and I guess there are two other issues with the Rangers that I see. The first one is chemistry, because that locker room seemed from the outside looking in, granted, toxic last year. They just couldn't get on the same page. The whole was less than the sum of its parts. And then I guess the other question is this. 2 years ago, they won the President's Trophy. Last year, they missed the playoffs altogether. They've made a lot of changes to that roster. They're not as good as they were 2 years ago. They're probably not as bad as they were last year. What are they? I don't think they even know at this point.
Right. And I think that's where the challenge is going to be for Mike Sullivan. I think he knows how to do the X's and O's, and he knows how to motivate a team. But can he put the pieces together here where, they haven't been able to, and Stanley Cup winning coaches have not been able to get it done thus far, there with Peter Laviolette. Of anybody, you would think he could have gotten it done, but he didn't. Is Mike Sullivan going to be different?
Well, we shall see. Look, it is not easy to win a Stanley Cup in New York. We have seen the Rangers win one Stanley Cup since 1940. And, whether it's the spotlight of Manhattan, the pressure, the way the Rangers have traditionally built their teams and run their franchise, all of these can be factors. But ultimately, I think they're in good hands right now, but it may take a little more time. And they have to be able to be a little bit patient with Sullivan, because to expect immediate results may be asking a lot.
Right. And patience, I think, is the word that I'm not sure will be heeded in Vancouver either. I think, Adam Foote taking on this responsibility when there was, a mutual parting of the ways with Rick Tocchet, when really Rick Tocchet just wanted to go coach the Flyers, it looked like, and was in a very, very difficult situation in Vancouver where, he wins the Jack Adams and then like things kind of go south there. But it was really because of ownership that it did, in terms of the contracts and the money and all of that. And maybe Rick Tocchet saw that there wasn't a light at the end of that tunnel and thought, the grass would be greener in Philadelphia, which is a choice, but I'll get to cover that this whole upcoming season.
Yes,
for sure.
You will.
But I think, Adam Foote stepping into that role is, it's his first head coaching job in the NHL, and doing it in Vancouver is a very difficult place to start.
It is. And, there was infighting there. Before they traded JT Miller, that locker room was divided.
Oh.
And again, like the Rangers, I kind of think the Rangers and the Canucks are the East-West version last year of similar situations, where the locker room just didn't seem to be on the same page, and the team didn't live up to the expectations and the talent level. You got to clean that up. And you almost get the feeling that Adam Foote has to come in and lay down the law as to how that locker room has to function. And whether or not a first-year NHL head coach can do that, that's a challenge.
Yeah, I think so too. That is going to be a situation to keep an eye on and see how Adam Foote takes on the head coaching mantle versus being just like one of the assistants there. I think Glenn Galutson in Dallas has a very interesting challenge ahead of him as well. Now, he's the most recent hire, just got hired on July 1st. It took them quite a while to figure out their head coaching situation. And this hire, I think, was a little bit of a surprise to some people. Didn't go on the regular carousel, found somebody new that hadn't been on it yet.
Not NHL-like when you think about it.
No, not at all. And I think it's a really interesting strategy by the Stars. But then now Galutson has to take control of this team that has under-delivered in a lot of ways.
They have had very large amounts of regular season success, but not playoff success. So I almost get the feeling that the pressure on him won't really fully hit until April, when unless the team falls off and doesn't even reach the playoffs. But the talent level there is so high. It's almost like managing the New York Yankees. You got to get into the playoffs, but once you're in, that's when you either are a success or a failure. The playoffs are expected, and I think right now in Dallas, the playoffs are expected, and then getting them past the first couple of rounds, that's going on that long playoff run is when he's going to earn his stripes or not earn his stripes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think this is one of the more high pressure situations in the NHL overall, new coach or returning coach. I think that, there's been some questions about the goaltending and can Ottinger withstand the playoff pressure. And to some degree, not to some degree, to an entire degree, that's not a coach's job, right? Is whether or not the goalie can come through. That's your goalie coach for sure. I don't think a lot of head coaches have a lot to do with the goaltending specifically, but I do think that again, those expectations are going to be super high in Dallas moving forward.
There is immediate pressure to succeed, And you know, a first round playoff exit or a non-playoff run, it could be one and done in Dallas.
Yeah, I think to me, the other team that we haven't talked about where there is also going to be a ton of pressure, but in a different sort of way, is Dan Muse in Pittsburgh, because this organization has tried to balance this, keeping the band together with rolling in new prospects and building assets to try and have a sustainable future here. And Dan Muse has to come in where the aforementioned Mike Sullivan was entrenched. I mean, there's practically like dents in the ground where his feet have walked, right? Around the arena and around the city of Pittsburgh, to come in and get the waning years of Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin. Like that has got to be a very difficult situation to walk into.
It is. And I still don't, you know, it's like the Penguins, you mentioned them trying to retool at the same time they're trying to give Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin and Chris Letang one more shot at the playoffs. It's like they're neither fish nor fowl. And I think almost they would benefit if they would choose a direction and go all in on it instead of trying to straddle these two strategies. So it's a difficult situation where on the one hand, maybe there shouldn't be expectations right away, but on the other hand, there kind of has to be because you want to get Crosby back into the playoffs.
It is just like a no-win situation in a lot of ways, because you really do want to create an environment that's going to allow Sidney Crosby to succeed, because you need him. You absolutely need him to, but you got to figure out the rest of the team in the future as well.
And I wonder to an extent if a guy like Crosby can almost not be officially an assistant coach, but could help the coach in motivating, in guiding that team, in even integrating the new coach into that locker room culture. He's been there so long. He is the face of the franchise, has been from day one. He may be able to help. Now, if you lose Sidney Crosby, you could lose the whole locker room at the drop of a hat. But if you get Sidney Crosby on your side, it could help ease the transition.
Yeah, I think so. All right. We've got some of these other coaching hires to talk about that I certainly have questions about, and we will get into that coming up next. All right, I've been sort of dancing around the topic of Rick Tocchet and the Philadelphia Flyers here, just because I've talked a lot about it on Locked On Flyers, of course. But I think it is a really interesting choice that both the Flyers and Rick Tocchet has made. I think it's out of the frying pan into the fire in a lot of ways for him with the Flyers, who are at a very, very critical juncture in this rebuild. And I think in some ways he's lucky, because the expectations for this upcoming season were not high to begin with in terms of making the playoffs. Like Danny Briere has said over and over again that this upcoming season is sort of the last season in this rebuild where they don't really expect them to make the playoffs. If they do, great. But if they don't, that's been the plan kind of thing. And so Rick Tocchet has the luxury in a lot of ways of making this adjustment, implementing his systems the way he wants, while trying to fold in some of the newer prospects onto the team, rebuilding what the Flyers offense looks like, what the defense looks like. And I think it'll be the year after that is going to be the real challenging one for him. But right now he's just got Matvei Michkov, who's going to do his thing. And they're going to try and figure out what the blue line is. And, goaltending is optional, as is always the case with the Philadelphia Flyers.
Yeah, since Hextall won, right? I mean,
yeah.
I mean, there is a little runway there. I wonder if him being a former Flyers player makes it easier or tougher for him coming back as the head coach.
Little of both.
Yeah,
I got to say. He's got a lot of fans, myself included. People who grew up watching him play and are very excited to have him back into the fold. We've seen him at alumni events for the last several years. And so it kind of seemed like this was the natural progression that was eventually going to take place. And there's a lot of confidence in his coaching. I think the one thing that we've talked about on Locked On Flyers that I appreciate is that he's very, very coordinated with the AHL coach. They have coaching meetings that go up and down the system from the ECHL all the way to the NHL and talking about where there can be continuity of systems so that call-ups go smoother and all of that. And that's something the Flyers have not done very much of, to be honest. So I'm excited for that aspect of it. I'm excited to see how this changes the dynamic from the John Tortorella era, but there certainly are some questions, and I think we won't know the answers for like a year and a half, but we'll get there eventually. And I think the other big question mark I have is Jeff Blashill in Chicago, because this is a team that should be taking a turn, right, in this rebuild. They have a generational player, not much around him that's been able to succeed, but they've started making moves to try and change that and to kind of ride that wave as a head coach that has not had extreme success elsewhere, has been good, but not like remarkable in any sort of way. Like that's got to be a really tough situation for him.
I get the feeling that all that needs to be done this year in Chicago is to stay in the race until like mid to late March, maybe early April. Sure. Like just make it interesting, show progress and make it interesting. I still think that the Blackhawks are maybe 1 year away from expecting to make the playoffs, even though, officially ownership and management is going to say to the fans, yes, we think we can make the playoffs this year. 95% of the teams try to say that to sell tickets and what have you. But I think if they show progress, if they keep it, if they stay in the race long enough, this will be considered a successful season for the Blackhawks.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I just want to see like Connor Bedard succeed in a way that, he was good this past season, but I don't think he was like as big a standout as he could have been. And I think they need to do a little bit more to build around that. And then I need to see what happens with this blue line on that team. I think that's going to answer a lot of questions as well. And then, of course, Joel Quenneville coming back into coaching after some time away from the game for reasons which we will like put aside for now. But I think that Anaheim is also in an interesting situation where they made a lot of changes this offseason and, tried to kind of get rid of the situations that were baggage for them in Trevor Zegras, who was under a constant trade conversation. And now he's with the Flyers, and John Gibson, was a trade bait target for what seems like centuries at this point, but it feels like he's been a trade target.
I don't think Zegras is 25, and I think he's been 3 years already of rumors about him. So yeah, they finally made moves on those two long-awaited players. I think the Ducks last year were where the Blackhawks, where we talked about what we hope the Blackhawks can do this year. They made it interesting. They stayed in the race until late. Now they to be successful, they need to get into the postseason, I think, for the first time in a while.
And we know Joel Quenneville has the track record of, coaching successful teams, but it was a little ways ago that happened. And like, does he still have it? I think is a valid question to ask. And is he going to be the right guy for this young team? Like, is the gap too big now? Yeah. Like to make that message and his quote unquote old school style of play, like, will that align with all these young players, like who have been coached differently? I have a lot of questions here.
It is going to be interesting. The record speaks for itself on the ice. He has a very impressive resume, wins and losses, championships, all of that, but is a guy who is old enough to have played for the Colorado Rockies of the NHL going to connect with the modern players of today?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest question I have about the Anaheim Ducks going into this upcoming season. But we'll see how these new coaches do. We'll see which of the coaches are the first to get fired in the new season, as is often the case. There's an early firing, and then it kind of wanes off until the tail end of the season there. But very important storylines to keep an eye on this upcoming season. That will do it for today's Locked On NHL. Of course, Gil will be back on Monday to talk with hosts from around the Locked On NHL network on what's going on with their teams. I will be back tomorrow with Erica L. Ayala for the Women's Hockey Report. We have so much going on there with Boston hiring a new coach, speaking of coaches. So we have a lot to talk about there, and plus we'll be continuing our series looking at each of the teams this off season. And the Locked On NHL show will be back next week beyond Monday as well. And we will see you next Friday. Have a good weekend, everyone.